electric vehicle sector and where we are in the US today with EVs. So as of now, as of this month, there's 800,000 electric vehicles on the road in the country. Last year, 2017, was the biggest year for EV sales yet, with almost 200,000 EVs sold. Last month, March 2018, was the biggest month ever for EV sales, just to give you an idea of the trend. And then on top of that, there's a lot happening with research into delivery, electrification of the delivery transportation fleet, Amazon, Uber, those types of things, autonomous vehicles, a lot of those are electric. And then on top of that, you have auto manufacturers, Volvo and GM, among others, have committed to 100% production of electric vehicles by a certain year, 2030, 2040. So that's just to give you an idea of EVs and where it's headed. I mean, we are headed for electrification. For the RFS and for how does that impact biomass. So the intent of the RFS is to replace fossil fuels with organic fuels for transportation. So typically when you think of the RFS, it's corn ethanol. You're at the pump and you see the 10% sticker or whatever. But we have said, and the EPA has agreed with us, that you're doing the same thing when you're powering your EV with biomass power. You are doing the same thing. You're replacing fossil fuels with agricultural fuels for transportation. So to that, with several members of Congress about this, but we would like to see the EPA allow, and they have said that technically we should qualify, and Patrick has had the same experience, so we're both working on this for RINs, it's Renewable Identification Number, it's RIN. And if you match up the power from EVs with the power that biomass, biogas, and the biogenic portion of waste to energy are putting on the grid, something like 2 cents per kilowatt hour right now, and that could grow with the growth of the EV sector. So that's where we're headed, and we're hoping to see that happen this year.
Maybe worth jumping into the electricity pathway. Like Carrie said, the purpose of the RFS is to replace fossil fuels with renewable fuels, and in doing that, to bring down the greenhouse gases that are related to any of those. And so, generally speaking, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but generally speaking, the fuels like those credits for corn ethanol will be a little bit less valuable than, say, a cellulosic or an advanced fuel credit, which can be worth a lot more. From the biogas perspective, and across the RFS, there are kind of different buckets of those kind of renewable energy feedstock to a vehicle fuel. So in the case of electrification, the vehicle fuel is electricity. In the case of biogas, the vehicle fuel is renewable natural gas, or RNG, which is the word that we give to biomass that's been upgraded to pipeline quality. $2.50 a gallon equivalent. Then there's the D5 category. Those are worth probably closer to about 75 cents a gallon today. And then for renewable electricity, it could fall into either one of those categories. Fossil natural gas, 1 MMBTU, 1 million BTUs of fossil gas is going to be worth about $3. So if you're making renewable natural gas or biogas, you could sell your gas for $3 because hardly anyone, maybe Procter & Gamble might, or other companies that have significant sustainability. If you sell it as vehicle fuel and you participate with the RFS, that $3 worth of gas, the credits that you can sell, the RINs that you can sell, are now worth between $9 and $30 a million BTUs on top of the $3 that you can sell the gas. And that's a game changer for the industry, and that's why there are a lot of projects approved by EPA, but has not yet been activated. I know we talked about this last year. It's still the same thing. The pathway is there. It's been approved, but EPA is not approving any of the projects that have registered. And so functionally, practically, you can't use the pathway because EPA isn't approving any of the projects. As soon as that happens, if you were to have a 5 cents a kilowatt hour, which in some areas is a little generous today, but 5 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity, that million BTUs is going to be worth about $5 for your gas. But if you can participate in the RFS and that renewable electricity then can go to vehicle fuel and you get the RINs associated with it. You know, we've got the fossil natural gas at $3, then you've got D5 at $9 on top of the 3, or if you can go to renewable electricity, you're getting an additional $15 a million BTUs, or if you can go to D3, which is cellulosic, you're getting an additional $30. So what we really need to do, the issue with this RFS and a lot of oil refineries complaining that they have to pay a lot to buy ethanol, for example, and that's a debate that's included the president, the administration, and the legislature. We need to apply pressure to EPA to activate the renewable electricity pathway. If you talk to EPA or if you have any way to get to the administration or the higher levels of EPA, the message is activate the renewable electricity pathway. It would impact many sectors of the biomass industry, and as Carrie said, that's where the vehicle industry is going. We need
bit about that as well. And for us, it was a little bit of a challenge because we thought about renewable gas. How are we going to use renewable gas in our facilities when we can't really compete, right? Because there's always going to be that RIN, and we're not willing to pay that kind of money. And it feels a little bit like a roadblock. What they're doing is they're going to power all of their facilities, including they're going to replace all their natural gas with renewable gas. How are they doing that? Well, they were very transparent about it. They said they're going to buy carbon offsets for 5 years, and during that time, they're going to use the RIN credit to really help pay for the project directly at all of their facilities. I thought that was a really creative way to, take what feels a little bit like a roadblock for those of us who maybe are not trying to do transportation, but still find a really credible way to use that credit and get a project off the ground. So,
state level. Are there any states or regions that are seeing above average growth in any of your sectors, or any states that are providing some solid incentives or programs? Tim, you could start.
Sure. A pathway, I think, to more sales. So air quality issues around this country are very real. And air quality issues come from a lot of different places, cars, mobile sources, and then also heating appliances. The reality is that in an uncontrolled old cordwood appliance, we've got some tough questions to answer there relative to particulate, et cetera, et cetera. The great news is that it's not the case with pellet appliances and pellets as a fuel. So there's 100% honest, aren't fans of wood heat at all, really any kind. If they could have their way, they'd throw the switch and we would burn natural gas, and the air quality challenges would be, in their mind, diminished. The reality, however, is that culturally they recognize that wood heat is. So we're trying to figure out how to navigate that and move forward carefully, right? It's difficult to engage in a dance with someone that you feel like they like your technology because it's the cleanest in a category that otherwise, if they could just, again, wave them, is if I'm the cleanest of the wood heat options, and we believe we are, how do I use that to my advantage without, I don't want to disenfranchise anybody else from the wood heat community, right? But the reality is that, very trying to understand how to use that as leverage to expand our presence in the Northeast. So that's certainly an area that we're looking at.
Okay. Anyone else?
I just say low carbon fuel standard, not just for electric vehicles, but also for CNG vehicles in any of the carbon markets out there. There's some incentives in North Carolina that are helping. New York State is rewriting how they handle a lot of renewable energy credits, and we're working on renewable natural gas right now. And so from the biogas perspective, there's pockets in several different
thermal RECs. So in their state's RPS, normally that's specifically geared towards electricity. There's a standard, the the state will mandate that the utility has to meet such a percentage of renewable energy for their electric production. Well, in New Hampshire, they did a carve-out of their electric portfolio standard total, and they said that you have to meet that with thermal renewable energy. It could be from biomass, it could be from solar thermal, it could be from geothermal. So lots of electricity systems is now available for biomass thermal systems as well as these other systems. Right now it's worth about $6 a million BTU is what the REC is worth. And so that's a pretty nice, that with a pellet system, something like that. So it's a pretty nice incentive on paying for the fuel that you're purchasing and gives you energy savings. Massachusetts has just this year implemented the same thermal REC as well. New York has put in place renewable energy goals for the state, and they have addressed thermal renewable energy. Massachusetts has been addressing thermal renewable energy, and then Vermont, I can't name the goal off the top of my head, but they've put in some really aggressive goals for renewable energy, and it being a big deal. And not surprisingly in states that do a lot of heating to start with, but certainly all the states have thermal, whether it's cooling or heating. And so I think that kind of trend, I'm guessing we'll see that continue to expand.
You've mentioned in your Biomass magazine column, as well as Pellet Wire, that you've initiated what you're calling Operation 100K. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, why you believe it's a worthwhile effort?
Out of a conversation I was having with PFI Chairman Stan Elliott, who's sitting right over here. And it was just a question I asked aloud is, just generally, without knowing the answer myself, what would happen if we could somehow reestablish 100,000 pellet appliance units as sort of the annual floor for pellet appliance sell-through? That was in 2009. Before that, we were kind of chugging along definitely with that 100,000 as the floor. In 2006, 118,000, 2007, 133,000, and again, apart from 2009, we haven't achieved it since. So this morning I was sort of putting together a $56,000 delta to that 100,000 floor. I totaled it all up. It's 328,000 appliances that we've missed collectively since 2008. If you assume that, rewind the tape, and we did achieve 100,000 appliances every year in 2008, that 328,000 of demand that we've sort of left on the table, if you can subscribe to, if you can follow the thought pattern there, well, that's massive. That's a massive number. And so it's also a cautionary tale. If we're not able to turn this ship around and we go another 10 years and don't see 100,000 or don't reestablish 100,000 units as our floor, it'll be another 1 million tons. And so your growth rate for the sector is going to be not great at all, because we haven't even talked about retirements, right? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35,000 pellet appliances come offline. So when you look at half, that's just not enough. That's not enough for our members. They deserve more. The value proposition of pellet heat is better than that. So the question I have is, well, what is it going to take to get to 100,000? And that's the floor, right? That's not the goal. That's where we want to have the floor be. That's the goal. So who are our partners? I talked about the thing that was really interesting to me as I started in this. Not just building a relationship myself, but of course all of my members have relationships with hearth retailers. And how can we enhance that relationship? How can we amplify the efforts of the Northern Forest Center and Heating the Midwest and Biomass Energy Resource Center and all these folks that I don't think that any one of those individually working sort of not in collaboration with others is going to get it done. It's a big job. But it's nice to know. It's nice to know the goal and begin to, again, scratch out some of these numbers and understand the math and say, a normal winter, which hard to count on that anymore, but I can't impact weather. I can't impact the price of heating oil. What can we turn our attention to? And I think we're turning our attention to how can we get more pellet appliances out there.
Mm-hmm. So kind of continuing that conversation of growth, are you paying attention to it?
3 years ago, we started to explore it on the sort of media side, and you know, it was this pocket of business inside of a lot of producers. And I actually went to a pellet mill, and that mill is still selling more pellets for heat, but he talked about just the margins and all of these notions that he was very excited about. So that's kind of the first time that I got tipped off onto it. And then again, in the last 3 months, I've learned a lot more about it. So out there, hard data, but we have it on good confidence that last year we sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 million pellet grilling appliances. So again, just putting the numbers to it, if you assume that each of those appliances burns 80 pounds of pellets in a year, and this has always been the pounds, it's not going to move the needle. Whereas if you buy a heating appliance, you talk about tons. I said, okay, that's fine. But again, you apply the math to it, 1.2 million pellet grilling appliances, 80 pounds, 96,000 tons and change heating appliances, assuming 2 tons, which can happen. Some places use 3, some places use less. We're almost at a situation where the demand introduced by barbecue grilling appliances is on parity with the demand introduced by heating appliances. So how can we not, back to that notion of 126 million households, how on earth do I possibly take the pellet value proposition to those? I don't have to. I've got 1.2 million people this year that last year didn't know where to get pellets, didn't know how to buy them, didn't know how to use them. Now they know right exactly where they are. I was going to become a pellet heating aficionado, but what a great place to start. What if I could convince just 5%? If I could convince 5% of those 1.2 million, and I could add that to the 47,000 folks that bought a pellet heating appliance this year, I'm at Operation 100K right there. There's 100,000. So it's exciting to me. Categorically, it's different. I recognize it's not a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of the attraction to it, but there's something there, and it's the PFI's responsibility to suss it out and make sure that we make the most of it.
All right. Well, let's move on to our favorite argument of carbon neutrality. Not too long after Trump took office, especially considering the pace at which the EPA Scientific Advisory Board has been moving at to determine how biogenic carbon emissions should be treated. So could you talk a little bit more about that, its implications? Was it really meaningful to the industry? And is the EPA's work done on that then, or are they still at it?
The EPA continues to work. 6 or 7 years now that the Scientific Advisory Board panel has been convened, and they still haven't concluded their work. They haven't issued a final framework that would eventually be accepted by the administrator. And from Trump saying biomass is carbon neutral, I do think that it makes a difference in an incremental difference. And yeah, we should consider biomass as fully a renewable energy source as any other renewable energy source, wind, solar, anything else. I think that you'll see some residual effects last month, or I guess it was in February. And he told us that he's committing to regulatory certainty for the industry, and he wrote a letter to the New Hampshire Governor Sununu that urged him to look at biomass incremental. Right now, there isn't really a policy on the table that would change if biomass is considered fully carbon neutral or not. I do think that down the road, having that, basically joining the rest of the world that does see biomass as carbon neutral, it sends a message to state governments is a renewable energy source that should be considered as part of your portfolio and should be used much more.
So Steve, Procter & Gamble is a business, and as our industry knows, there are a lot of vocal groups, NGOs that condemn absolutely any kind of biomass energy use. So what's Procter & Gamble's stance and response, and why did you guys choose to go with biomass rather than a different fuel or technology?
a great question. I mentioned when I was talking earlier that business in terms of protecting wildlife, habitat is really important to them. And so the topic of biomass does create a bit of tension for them because they all understand that, you know, as you pointed out, if you're not doing biomass sustainably, it can be damaging. So they have a lot of concern. But on the other side, they also do see climate change as one of the largest risks to wildlife. And they have some incredibly intelligent people there at work on energy, people that really help guide a lot of what we do at Procter & Gamble. And they are very supportive and understand we need to be doing this kind of work. That's part of the reason why they're helping lead the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. And for Albany specifically, the Biomass project, they actually helped us to, before we had even met Constellation as a potential partner, put in place sourcing guidelines. So they recognize that biomass, I don't want to speak so that was all ready to go once we did have Constellation as a partner. And ultimately, they also lended their name to the announcement. They were part of the announcement that we were doing that project. So I find them to be very understanding and very practical of it, along as we continue to really pay attention to the sustainability and the sourcing guidelines. And that's really where I think our partnership with them has been the most important. They really help give us some really good technical guidance to ensure that the work we're doing is sustainable. We've also turned down projects. You know, I had a project in Europe that really was presented to Procter & Gamble and really did have some legitimate concerns with it. And so we said, we're not going to do that because that's not good for anyone. And so in general, I think they're very supportive of biomass. We are. You know, in terms of carbon neutrality, you know, there's two ways to think about it. There's like the sustainability technical part. I actually own greenhouse gas accounting for our company. And it's pretty simple because we follow WRI, greenhouse gas protocol, and it essentially says biomass is biogenic. That's a separate category. And our goals are scope 1, scope 2 goals. And so when we do go to biomass, it definitely helps our goals. It's very important to us. Mm-hmm. The tougher part is the other part, which is how do you talk about it? And so, you know, we had some conversation about how do we talk about this project, because you know, it's when you're talking to the general public, which is what our messaging is really designed for, there's a lot of complexity in that topic. And so really I just defaulted to a little bit more of a conservative position and said, you know what, let's not try to talk about how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions we've eliminated, because then folks will remind us that there's CO2 and they might not understand it. And so we really just tried to focus our messaging on this, because we know this is sustainably sourced materials. We made sure that that message of working with WWF was in our messaging so the folks could feel confident that all the materials of our project were sustainably sourced, but that project is better than burning natural gas. And so it was really more of a message of, in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, this is a step forward versus trying to get into specifics that really are kind of complex and still hard to kind of dive into when you're talking to the general public.
Can I just add something? I think one of the other key arguments, especially with the World Wildlife Foundation being involved and being concerned about habitats, is that there are a lot of private landowners out there that have forest land or land with lots of trees on it. And if you can't help those landowners to be able to make some money from their woody biomass, you're not going to be able to keep forests as forests. And so to help get the environmental community to get engaged in, let's use biomass responsibly, but also profitably, you can do both, is really how we're going to protect habitat and help protect the forests of the country.
So Steve, how was community support for that biomass project, and did you guys do anything special to interact with the community? You know, you mentioned your efforts on sustainable sourcing. I know that's something that you've probably emphasized to the community.
Yeah, you know, I was a bit nervous, to be honest with you, because the Sterling did have some concerns. They had a very well-organized group that expressed some concern about the project where they were relocating, and we weren't necessarily sure what was going to happen when we brought the project to Albany. But the one thing that was great is, I mean, Procter & Gamble, I don't know how long we've been in Albany, but it's decades. And you know, we are a part of that, deep part of that community. Our employees are the community, and so the community knows us and that plant very, very well. We have a really strong relationship with the citizens and the government, and they trust us. And they can do that because we've been there for a long enough time that, and really it was 100% supportive in terms of the relationship we have with the community. And part of it probably helped that we already had a biomass operation there. And really what we were doing is replacing that and with a larger one. But you know, the community, it was interesting. Our vice president, Rick McLeod, came to the groundmaking ceremony, and the thing he talked about was people. You know, at the end of the day, that project, that biomass project, was about the people, and it was the people of that community, and the jobs, and really the and what we were about in that community, what we brought, what the community brings to us, and it was this message of people that I think really drove it home. So it was nothing but a positive experience in Georgia.
Okay, great. I have one more question before I am going to open it up if anybody in the audience has a question. Dan, you mentioned that the U.S. wood chip standard is finally done. Could you explain more about what it entails and why it's important to the wood heat industry?
Yeah, sure. So as a specifying engineer, when I go to spec out a boiler, a fuel oil boiler, I know that the fuel that's going to be used in that boiler, it has 140,000 BTUs per gallon. I know what the makeup of that is, and I pretty well know what the efficiency of that boiler is going to be if I run it with that fuel at a well-tuned condition. On the wood pellet side, the standards are there for that. In the biomass industry, you know, you have a pretty good, that's a good fuel. You know exactly roughly how many BTUs you're getting out of that fuel per pound. On the wood chip side, though, especially at the smaller, what I call a small to medium-sized commercial scale, the quality of the wood chip really makes a big difference in the system that you're using in terms of what its BTU output is, whether it actually is handled well in the handling system for that boiler system. And what we don't have in the U.S. is a standard for that, or what we didn't have until just a couple months ago. So the Biomass Energy Resource Center organized a group of BTEC members and the industry in general, and went through a standards process, which is a long process. But we were able to use international ISO standards as the base, and we now have different classes of wood chips categorized based on their size, moisture content, and their sourcing. So that's something that's available now. If you're working on projects, I would encourage you to reference that. If you're a boiler manufacturer or an equipment manufacturer that handles wood chips, I'd encourage you to get familiar with that as a tool for you to use to be sure that your customers are purchasing the fuel you think they're purchasing. And so that's a really big deal. If you want to, become mainstream in the industry, on the wood chip side, you really have to have a standard fuel that vendors can then reference to build standard equipment that specifiers can then reference to get standard results on a project. And so that's why it's a big deal for the industry. It's now available. I think it's not super expensive. I think it might be $75 or something like that. ASABE holds the standard. It was through ASABE's Agricultural Biological Engineers Society, something like that. But the group that developed it, including a bunch of BTEC members, developed a 2-page kind of summary of that gives you some information on how to use the standard, which is quite technical. And it also gives a fuel spec for owners who might own systems to go out and procure fuel based on the specification. It gives kind of a draft of that. So there's some tools available, and there's a website that has those tools. And one of our BTEC members is going to be talking about that, Charlie Niebling, later. I don't remember which session he's in, but he's on one of the sessions.
Awesome, okay. Audience, if anyone has a question, there are microphones, or you can stand up, speak loudly. Right there in the front. Are there microphones? Yep, there's one over there, or there's one over there. No problem.
Thank you. I'm Jim Davidson. We supply biomass to biomass facilities. I'm a forester, land manager. I've never heard of any standards being developed. Of course, that's why we come here, to learn cool new stuff. How can you develop standards when everything is so localized? The species are localized, the boiler is localized. We tend to get with the engineer. The engineer says, well, we need this kind of specification. And that's what we develop, and that's what we supply. So I'm really confused why we have a national standard, if you will. Didn't even know they existed, much less apparently I got to spend $75 to get a copy.
Yeah, no, that's right. We tried to get it so it was free, but it was definitely not. You can't get it for free. I think you're mentioning it's local, and that's kind of one of the important things for standardizing it. So, you know, if you're working with a larger biomass system, those are typically, you know, anything over, say, 50 million BTUs an hour, hog fuel, or whatever fuel you want to identify and kind of get some rough specs on that. But if you're in the smaller commercial world where you want to work with commercial that are able to kind of stamp out equipment based on a certain specification for the fuel, and so it's not a one-off manufacturing of the boiler based on the local fuel that's available. So you really need a more broadly known million BTUs an hour. The boilers that they make for biomass are literally off-the-shelf biomass boilers. And that's because they know that when they go out to source wood chips for those boilers, they can say that's available in the industry. Folks are either drying it as needed to get to the moisture content they need or resizing as needed, and that's a known thing. So if you want to reduce the cost of the installations, you have to have a broader standard than a local standard. Reach out to as many folks and get as much input as we possibly could. You know, there's probably opportunities to revise the standard if you don't like what's in it. But I'd say try and take a look at it. If you have a lot of boiler fuel you're selling in your area and you see new systems coming online, this may be something coming down the pike that you'll see and they're going to install.
Next question?
Yes. Is it on? Okay.
Yep.
Couple of questions. I'd like to say thank you first that we have some agricultural.
10, so it's okay.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Land grant university and all.
There you go.
Was the figure 12 million households thrown out earlier about that's the number of households?
No. I said 126 million households in the country.
Oh, 126 million.
126 million in
Well,
the
each 100,000.
Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if I divide that by 100,000 into your 126 million, I think, aren't you worried that in about 1,200 and some years, your demand's all going to be gone?
That'd be a great problem to have. A great problem to
Okay,
have.
seriously though,
Yes, sir.
pellet stoves.
Pellet stoves, absolutely, or
How
boilers.
How do you overcome the issue then? The first thing that my insurance agent asked me when he's renewing or writing my policy is, do you have any solid fuel burning devices for heat in this house?
Right. It's a great question. Interesting. It's a question that comes into pelletheat.org with some regularity. So it's on a working list for me to understand, is that an actual fact? Is it an actual fact against all carriers, right? Are all these, is every burning device in my home? I don't anymore. Regrettably, I live in the upper Midwest, so pellet heat is not ubiquitous there, or it's not really ubiquitous anywhere. But at any rate, I don't know the answer to that, sir. It's a very real thing. Even if it's let's just say that we dig into it, and really there's maybe one carrier that asks that. If it's a perception out that, then it's something that needs our attention and something that needs to get fixed if we can fix it. So I appreciate the question. I assure you it's definitely on my radar.
Is there a standard for pelleting? For pellet, like you, is there a standard on the pellet making that they have to be a certain density and certain BTUs per pound?
Absolutely. The PFI has developed a standard, and we have that in place. Absolutely.
When did that come about? Can you tell me?
I don't know. Stand left, but it's within the last decade. How about that?
Yeah, it kind of links me back to, I think my dad came up with we had a maple syrup operation where you had a boiler, evaporator, and you had to throw in, we were using wood, cut from our wood. Out there taking, and a few years ago, cutting wood, and my son was with us, and he started raking up all the chainsaw bits and putting them in and then And he says, my father says to him, well, you can go ahead and do that, but don't worry about it. We got these big 4-foot pellets.
Bruce Lyle from Energex. By the way, the PFI has had a 5 years ago, we came up with a very major change to our standards program. And the majority of the whole industry now, in the pellet industry, we have certified our plants under this particular standard. So if you ever go around in an industrial area and see like plants, it's just not the product quality, it's the way we manufacture. It's a whole theory and realm for us to operate these plants. Dan, this is a question you had earlier about checkoff. And I don't know if you're familiar, about 3 years ago at the behest of Carlton Owen from the U.S. Forest Endowment, he got together biomass electric guys, the export pellet producers and the domestic producers, and formed a working group to put together a wood energy checkoff program. Now, his success with the softwood lumber group, it's a softwood lumber, and that was our expectation too. However, you know, after this group, we worked for 3 years. We all invested several $100,000, and especially the Forest Endowment, they matched all the money that we raised. What happened is last year is the electric guys, because of the diverse nature of their industry, we couldn't come up with 50% of the producers and 50% of the capacity in a straw poll, so the electric guys had to bow out. So that left us just the pellet producers, the export guys, and us domestic folks. And we went through a straw poll and had initial success with it. And then at the last minute, one of the major export facilities pulled out of the project, and then was left with the domestic guys. And us domestic guys said, let's go forward because we want to help Tim in his 100K program. I like to think that 250K, Tim, but considering the fact that
Bruce.
Considering the fact that Italy sells 5 times more stoves than we do, it's kind of an embarrassment. However, the domestic producers in our straw poll, initially we were happy with it, and then we just recently had a major producer pull back, who we're still trying to convince to get into this, because we feel that the promotion of pellet appliance, the promotion of woody biomass as a renewable resource needs to continue. So it's still on the table, but it's not looking very favorable right now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bruce. So that's the challenge that we seem to have, is that we can't, you know, you're talking about the people pulling out, and if we can't kind of all group together to pool the resources that we need to do a national marketing campaign, that seems to be the challenge. Do you see those players coming back to the table, or do you see that as fairly well dead from your interactions and the checkoff discussions?
Well, I would tell you right now it's kind of dead, but you know, we're always hopeful. We're still trying to work on it. Because this industry is small, we have to collaborate. That's the only way that we're going to get anything done. We can't do it as individual producers. We have to work together, and that's what we've always done at PFI for many, many years. So hopefully we'll see what happens.
Thanks.
Great to have a tenured member in the audience to help me out of my situation with the standards program. So. But to Bruce's point, you know, and whether it's a checkoff program or some other vehicle, I feel like when you look at that number that I shared earlier, again, just talking specifically about the pellet segment, 1 million tons of demand that we've kind of left on the table because we're not bringing enough consumers to our product. And so what is 1 million tons? That's like $160 wholesale. So we're talking about $160 million of revenue that we're just leaving on the table by virtue of not bringing enough consumers. Checkoff programs do that. My question is, if you're not going to support checkoff programs, if you're not going to be a member of one of these associations up here, how are you going to get it done? How are you going to grow your business? And I think I agree with Bruce that individually, it's going to be a pretty big. I think the answer there is yes. Should I support a checkoff program? I'd ask people to really consider that. Great comment, Bruce. Thanks, Dan, for bringing it up, too.
Next question right over here.
Okay, Val Chanco from Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Biomass provides a myriad of benefits, as you alluded to. Share something for all the speakers, the cost, whether it's biogas, biopower, the pellet stove, the thermal application of biomass. Where are we in, and what will it take to help us as an industry to accelerate the penetration of biomass, biogas, or biopower, or the thermal application of biomass?
Right away, right? No one's going to develop a biogas project if, no matter how much it costs, and they are capital intensive, if it's not going to be worth it. I think one of the key things to look at, though, is the material that these projects are producing, whether it be a biogas project or another biomass project. We have to find a way to manage this material. When you look at wastewater plants, and unless everyone stops flushing their toilet, or unless everyone becomes vegan in our country, and we start finding ways to eat pineapple tops and banana peels and stuff like that, and someone will probably figure that one out. But we're going to have lots of food waste, we're going to have lots of manure, we're going to have lots of solid in our wastewater that we have to produce. And so regardless of the cost, and I think we can show great value, but regardless of the cost, we have to find a way to manage that material. Why not manage that material in a way that's going to produce renewable energy and soil amendments on top of it? The other thing to look at when you're looking at cost, and especially comparing to wind and solar, is capacity factor. You look at biomass plants and you look at biogas plants, we are base load. We are like 90, high 90s, in terms of the time that we're offline, which has to happen every so often. So these are constant power sources. And when you look at how much wind and solar have to be developed to get the same power output, you're talking 4 times more capacity, I believe, for wind, and 6 times more capacity for solar based on common capacity factors. And so then when you look at the cost of wind and solar and you multiply them by 4, and you might if you just look at $1 per kilowatt capital cost. And then when you add the fact that we need to manage the material that's going into these, we don't have to manage our sunlight, we don't have to manage the wind, but we do have to manage our biomass. Then there's a societal need there on top of it that provides additional value, and they're just worth it.
Save them money. And one of the things that we've found that biomass and bioenergy is usually pretty good at, because we are looking at residual streams that end up fueling the products that we've produced in terms of pellets, or the direct fuel in terms of chips or cordwood or something like that. Basis and a lot of times, even against low natural gas prices. One thing, but the capital costs are an issue. And if you look at other energy sources like solar and wind, they're getting a lot of incentives to help pay for those capital costs that allow them to, what we really need is investment in the capital up front, and to really kick the industry off in a big way, and we really haven't seen that at the federal level. States have done that, but there's really nothing out there for biomass thermal anyway at the federal level. So I think that's a big deal in the energy industry. Just let everybody compete on their costs alone, and that could be one way to do it. That's probably not realistic, so what we're really pursuing is kind of similar incentives across all types of industries or energy technologies.
Okay, let's move on to that microphone.
100,000 installations a year. Let's assume that we can reduce the production cost, which we're working on, by 25% for delivered pellets to the households. How much would that help you to increase your sales effort or ambition to reach?
Time that we had over 100,000. Throw out 2009. Seems to be a bit of an outlier, but 2007. My guess is that the price difference between heating oil and the price of wood pellets was pretty great, right? And that was the value proposition that we took to the marketplace, and it found traction. I think as the cost of heating oil continues to rise, assuming it does, that you'll hear PFI really trumpeting that. The challenge for me, though, is what happens when the inverse of that is true? We just fold up the playbook and we're done with it. We're done trying to win people over to wood heat. weren't saying anything. I was like, gosh, we don't really deliver a value now what? So my whole thing is, I'm interested in carrying that message forward. However, I'm also interested in trying to understand what can bring a consumer to my product, how to tell my members they need to drive down the cost of their production or lower their price so we can compete with heating oil. So I want to take a different value proposition forward when that price differential isn't as favorable as it has been, because again, when I took the job, I told the board, I said, I can't impact the price of heating oil, and I can't prolong winter. I want to push back on the assertion because I think there's more reasons to have a pellet appliance than just because it delivers savings at the home. So I'll talk to you more about it after the general session. I want to make sure we got one more question over here, I think, Anna.
Yep.
You guys spent a lot of time talking about how to get government funding on a similar level for biomass. A lot of people are not in favor of like government funding for wind and solar because they would not make sense standing on their own. If we are advocating for parity, have any of your organizations actually considered advocating for reducing the funding of other forms of non-biomass heat in order to achieve that parity? Have we actually even considered like bringing theirs down?
For our organization, but whenever we have a talking point, when we started out maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I joined BTEC, the talking point when we walked into the meetings was, listen, you, with the legislators that we were given was, hey, listen, you incentivize the oil industry through some pretty favorable look the other ways on environmental environmental impacts that they have. Same with the natural gas industry. There's master limited partnerships that are vehicles, tax vehicles for how these industries are developed. There's a lot of incentives on fossil fuels that are provided by state and local. We'd love to compete on that basis with the environmental benefits and the cost that we have. And we would be happy to do that. And when the answer is, well, that's not realistic, then we say, okay, well, give us some money too. So that I don't have a good answer. The answer to your question is the case.
Patrick and I have this conversation on the Hill on practically a weekly basis. Your view is not, a lot of people have thought the same thing that you're saying. But, I think the short answer is there was talk of that happening in the tax package that passed a couple months ago. But, when those credits don't go away, which they have really strong lobbies, and, they're out there fighting to keep them, we have to be part of the game. We have to play the game too. And then the other point, we're putting electrons on the grid, and it's when you're buying power, it's how many electrons and what's the cost, and for biomass, like you don't get the full, we don't get paid for those other benefits, and the government can help to make sure that we do. Those other benefits are getting rewarded.
Just to add to that, Dan and Carrie both made excellent comments. I think one of the key things to remember here is that when we're talking about parity and trying to compete equally in the marketplace, there's kind of two levels. One is what we've been talking a lot about, which is parity with to create a level playing field. But then there's the oil and gas industry, and they've got permanently baked in incentives into the tax code that Dan was alluding to. And even if we achieve parity among the renewable energy, we've still got to compete with oil and gas. And so, are there any politicians that you think that we can find, or a appreciable number, in addition to other renewable energy tax credits, in order to create that level playing field? And so, from my perspective, this isn't about our industry going out and asking for another handout from the government. This is a defensive move. We've got our backs up against the ropes because I've got biogas project developers who are trying to get financing for their projects from a bank, and the bank says, you know what, I can make money off of the tax credit from wind and solar. I'm going to invest in that wind and solar project because of that tax credit. I'm not going to invest in the climate that our tax policy has created. So could we overhaul our tax policy and create a level playing field? Absolutely. Do I think that that is practically possible? Unfortunately, no.
One more question over there.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Will Haas with a company called Cirrus Financial out of Minneapolis. We advise on ups and downs we've seen in the industry. In the past 10 years, we've financed about 600 million gallons of ethanol. And I've also gotten really involved in the biomass, woody biomass to energy industry as well. And currently, I wasn't intending to stand up and talk the path forward. And this is a good segue, Patrick, about the capital impediment that we face in deploying biomass. It might look good. It's an advocacy-based industry, but it's not. It's hard to compete against free wind, free sunshine, and nat gas. That right now, I thought I'd bring it up to you. We currently represent a 50 megawatt biomass plant in Texas. Tim, we talked about this about 2 years ago. I don't know if you recall, you wrote an article about it in BBI. So over the past 2 years, we've been working on getting it out of litigation, and now it's owned free and clear. And we've had a lot of discussions about RINs and RECs. And look back 10 years ago, people were underwriting $7 a REC. Now it's trading the federal RECs about 30 to 40 cents. And so it's just, talk about getting the rug pulled out from underneath you. And so now what our primary focus is that in ERCOT in Texas, there will never be a biomass plant run in Texas. So right now we're looking to relocate the plant to another grid, either it be international or domestic. And so the reason why I'm out here today is to kind of get a feel for what's happening in the industry. Are there any new developments going on? Steve, you mentioned with P&G, maybe it's something that should be talked about. It'd be unfortunate to see a new biomass. People are looking to build new biomass generation facilities. When you're looking at the capital impediments that you're facing, there are opportunities out in the market today that can bring your capital costs down by half. And so for us to relocate our plant elsewhere, we can do it for half the cost of building a new one. And so I bring that up to let the room here know that there are, if we continue to communicate with one another, there are ways that we can knock down that capital. Try to get a pulse for it. I'm bummed out to hear that there aren't any new projects underway, but maybe there would be if you knew of some opportunities in the market that would bring the capital stack in half. So thanks for your time.
All right, I think that actually is going to wrap up our discussion today. Audience members, I hope that you all found value in it. We are going to break for lunch and socializing in the Expo Hall. Before I do, I want to thank our CPM Depew for sponsoring this talk, and our lunch sponsor is Kobo. So please, everyone, join me in giving our panelists a hand.
Yay. Nice to meet you, Steve.
Yeah, you too.
Good job. That went really well.
Good job.